May I speak in the name of our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. Please be seated. Once upon a time, there was a deeply faithful monk. He lived a life of poverty, simplicity, and chastity in a secluded monastery, a life marked by regular times of prayer, diligent study, generous hospitality, and genuine kindness. He gave himself freely as a disciple of Christ and found great meaning in this life of service. At a ripe old age, he became ill and swiftly declined. One evening, after receiving last rites, his breathing slowed and his body settled, and his brothers took him for dead. It was the custom of this order to bury the dead in a wall along the edge of the property, where tombs were sealed over by stones laid by the brothers. And so, after the funeral mass, they took their friend to his final resting place, and brick by brick sealed him into the rock, returning his mortal form to the earth. The next day, while toiling in the fields, a couple of the monks heard muffled sounds coming from the wall. Alarmed, they ran to the new grave and began tearing the bricks from the freshly laid mortar, a rush of dank air coming out of the tomb along with the cries of their friend, not dead at all, but very much alive. The abbot was summoned as the brothers gathered, slowly dissembling the wall as the monk explained that he had indeed died or come close, and he went to heaven, and he met St. Peter and Jesus, and it was nothing like the church had taught. He had seen eternity, and it was not what they expected. The abbot and the other monks became alarmed at the words of their friend, and decided that before word of this strange occurrence could get out, to reseal the wall, closing the door forever on their once-upon-a-time brother and the disturbing truth he brought back with him. This haunting, apocryphal tale, which I found in a book of theology by Quaker author Parker Palmer, says a lot about how many people experience their faith. We think we know something about God, about eternity, about truth. We are willing even to give our lives to it. But then we dig a little deeper and encounter something that challenges what we once thought we knew. And we may not approach it with curiosity and wonder, with adventure and trust. Instead, we may try to turn away, to ignore, deny, or bury this new information, this thing that doesn't seem to fit. Better to seal it away in the wall than have to make room for it in ourselves, our worldview, our faith. Today we celebrate the feast of St. Francis, and my guess is many of us think we know something about this guy. He has quite the reputation, after all. Talking to birds, communing with the earth. A real tree hugger, that one. There's also the time he talked that wolf into leaving the good people of Gubbio alone, his forward-thinking friendship with St. Clare, his kindness to lepers, his penchant for hitchhiking and poverty and organic vegan cuisine. He sounds pretty cool. A nice face for the counterculture of the 12th century, palatable and inspiring even today to Christians and non-Christians alike. But if we dig a little deeper, we might be surprised by what we uncover about Francis. Like the vast majority of his writing is not about peace, love, and communing with the earth. In fact, the only two surviving examples of such writing are probably his most widely known. The Canticle of Creation, which begins, "Be praised, good Lord, for brother Son," and the prayer of St. Francis, which we'll say together shortly. "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace." Instead, the overwhelming majority of Francis' writing is about the Eucharist. He was unconventional, there's no question about that, but his piety was deeply sacramental. He was profoundly moved by the example of Jesus, not only in heart, but in mind and body. And it was Jesus' own homelessness, his example of self-giving and self-emptying love, epitomized on the cross and remembered around the altar, that led Francis to the road, from traveling from town to town, begging for food, trusting entirely in God's providence, as he tried to share this great good news with anyone he could find. He was not so much a flower child as a Jesus freak, or maybe a bit of both. So sincere, so heartfelt, so deep was his faith, his piety, his gratitude for Christ's sacrifice, and his earnest desire to live in the way of Jesus, that Francis is the first saint credited in the Catholic tradition with receiving the stigmata, his hands and feet split open as with nails on the wood, his side wounded by a spear. In fact, one way to tell if a medieval piece of art is depicting Francis, like the one on the cover of your bulletin, is to look for those wounds. So close was his heart to the heart of Jesus that his body began to resemble it too. At first blush, this fuller, truer, more multi-dimensional and nuanced picture of Francis, son of Assisi, might not much resemble our initial impressions or the impressions of those outside the church that have become so popular. The guy who was so out there that even a city like San Francisco proudly bears his name. But if we turn away too quickly, if we are too alarmed by this new information and the apparent discrepancies and complexities that come with it, that we're tempted to seal it back in the wall and pretend we never knew, well, we do ourselves a disservice. Francis was a deeply traditional Christian. He was fervently moved by the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He held very high views of tradition, clergy, doctrine. And it was out of this deeply sincere and incredibly orthodox love and commitment not only to Christ, but to Christ's church, that Francis chose willingly a life of poverty and instability, a life traveling from place to place, owning nothing, relying on the kindness of strangers, that he came to see the Spirit of God not only in the bread and wine made holy at communion, or in the people who took those elements into their bodies and out into the world, as we do Sunday after Sunday, but also in the sick and the sinful, the orphan and the outcast, the squirrels and the rats and the gnats and the trees and the flowers and the sun and the streams and the stars. Francis' entire life was so consumed with the love of God that he came to see God everywhere, to celebrate God everywhere, and to reverence God everywhere, not in spite of his traditional Christian faith, but because of it. Seeing our piety and our curiosity at opposite ends of a spectrum is not only unhelpful, it's unnecessary. There is nothing more traditional than for a Christian to be called to love God, to love ourselves, our neighbors, strangers, the earth, and every living thing. The invitation for each of us, not only once for all, but over and over again, is to discern how God would have us live out of this radical, traditional, and beautiful faith. I've heard many people moved by the example of Francis, also, frankly, turned off by it. His path was so extreme, his way so costly, it can seem nearly inhuman. What is one to learn from it, to take from it? But here's the thing. I'm sure there were countless other saints alive during Francis' time, folks who, like him, were consumed with a fiery passion for the Eucharist and the rituals of the church, who eagerly came to Mass and confession, who wished with all their heart, mind, souls, and strength to follow the way of Jesus, and who were called into marriage, into carpentry, into business, into parish ministry, into agriculture or literature or law or travel or government or teaching. All of these vocations could be faithful ways to order a life after the way of Jesus. The takeaway from Francis' example is not that we are all called to radical poverty, eco-activism, and outspoken evangelism, though some surely are, but that we are invited into the very same love that Francis fully embraced, and that we can trust the God who is calling to us from that very center to show us how we might live more fully, more faithfully. In traditional Christian language, we call this exercise in listening discernment, and it is at the heart of the mission of the church. The whole reason for all of this is to support one another in discerning God's call on each of our lives and on our life together. We have countless opportunities to do this, infinite even, and we can always shift course or change our minds, correct our paths. The point is that there is no one way, because God made each of us unique to shine with God's unique and boundless glory, so that what might look like a bit much to one feels liberating and life-giving and relieving to another. It's not that anything goes, but that the going does look different for each of us. I've recently been talking with a lot of Catholics who are struggling with how their church is responding to sex abuse scandals and resisting the leadership of women, and who are questioning their ongoing identification with Rome as a result. And whenever this comes up, I'm keenly aware of how many faithful responses there might be to their very holy angst, anger, and grief. I'm sure some of them are called to leave. I'm sure for many, staying would feel like the end of their genuine connection with Jesus, who always sided with the vulnerable and violated. And I'm sure there are others who are being called to stay and to keep advocating for change from within, and to be a thorn in the side of their parish council and their local priest and whoever else will listen. And I'm sure there are people called to every possible place in between those two extremes. I offer this example not to rag on our Catholic siblings, but as a reminder that at different points in our own history, the Episcopal Church has been and continues to be the same. When women were not allowed not only to be ordained in our tradition, but even to serve on the vestry or assist with the leadership of worship, there were some who left, indignant and outraged and tired of waiting. But there were others who stayed and advocated and agitated and faced tremendous pressure and suspicion and out hostility until we were welcomed into the ranks of ecclesial leadership. And both of these could have been faithful responses. Both played a part in moving our church closer to the kingdom. So when someone comes to me to talk about their struggle with their church, this or another, I can rarely recommend one specific course of action. Instead, I try to support them in their discernment. This is, by the way, as true in our personal lives and conundrums as it is in the life of faith. Years ago, I stood in the kitchen of a family friend who had been like a second mother to me, helping to chop potatoes for a holiday meal, and listened to her talk about her marriage. It had recently come out that her husband had been for years engaging in affairs all across the country, to the point of maintaining other homes and seemingly entirely other lives. She was bereft, shocked, enraged, but mostly she was heartbroken and felt deeply betrayed. She loved this man. She had raised children with this man, had shared a life, had trusted him, and now he was repentant, willing to do anything to save their marriage, and she just didn't know what to do. I listened patiently, somewhat surprised that she was sharing all this with me. Maybe she was too. And then I put down my knife and turned to her, and we had our first real adult conversation. And I asked questions, and she cried. And after a while, I said something along the lines of, well, it seems to me that there are times when leaving is the right thing to do, and there are times when staying is the right thing to do. I don't think the point is for you to figure out the one right way to move forward, but the right way for you to move forward, here and now. And it sounds like you don't know yet, and that's okay. I just hope you'll be gentle with yourself and ask for as much help as you need as you figure that out. There's not much I said or did when I was 22 that I think of as particularly wise, but I'm still pretty sure that this was right on. And my friend looked so relieved to know that she didn't have to answer once and for all the question of how to mend or end a marriage after adultery. She just had to learn how to live her life right then and there, exactly as it was. So God, in God's infinite goodness and grace, calls to us in love, invites us up and out, laying before us a wealth of possible ways forward, and invites us to step out in hope. The way before us might call for courage and conviction and clarity. It might be hard. It also might be exactly what we have been hoping for, praying for, begging for, a welcome relief, a way we hadn't let ourselves dream might unfold. Perhaps we'll be called to stay. Perhaps we'll be called to go. Perhaps, like Francis, we'll be called out of the building, but not out of the church, out of convention, but not out of tradition, out of our suffering, but not out of our situation. No matter how it looks to the outside, all of these paths lead to the same place. So listen, stay open, get curious. God is calling each of us today, right now. How will we respond? Amen.